this main character, he is on the one hand sort of pushing back against what he sees to be the austerity of Pascal, and then on the other hand, is basically the most austere character that we encounter in the film. There's four main characters. There's Jean-Louis, who is the engineer we've been talking about. There's his friend Vidal, who's a Marxist philosophy professor at the local university. There's Maud, who's a pediatrician and whose apartment they go to visit the day after Christmas. Or I guess it's Christmas night, rather. And then there's Francoise. Francoise, yeah. She's the blonde woman with whom Jean-Louis becomes enamored, after he sees her at Mass.
Yeah.
And she becomes kind of the object of his love and his pursuit.
Yes, he says he knew that she would be his wife.
Right, right. But, we come to find out that even in her instance, she has had an affair. She's enabled an affair by taking a married man as a lover. Vidal is a total, what's the word? He's a kind of playboy. Mm-hmm. And Maud is also, she's called a free thinker. Never been baptized, but she's a divorcee, and we are also given to
seductress.
Yeah, right. So Jean-Louis, is kind of in the midst of this, being the only one seemingly who has sort of hard moral lines, and acts on principle in his own way. He's a very principled man, but it's not, as you mentioned, a fully Catholic, like a fully robust Catholic moral sense. It is kind of something that well, I don't know. I don't want to say that it's half baked, but it's kind of flirting with the world and doesn't seem to have a kind of urgency to convert behind it.
He talks
necessarily
about how he's mediocre. And he doesn't really isn't really convinced that everybody can be a saint.
Right.
And so he thinks that he can acquire a certain justness in the biblical sense of the word, he claims, even with his mediocrity and his half-heartedness.
I mean, one thing we see, our hero, he definitely presents himself as aspiring to a middle-class Christianity, so to speak. He doesn't think he's called to be a saint, just to be, a just man in a more modest sense, or he puts it in a biblical sense. And then the film makes a point of making clear that it's not only our hero who is loyal to a certain tradition with its teachings, its ways. It's also Maud, who comes from an old free-thinking family. And so Jean-Louis, our hero, and then Maud, they represent two opposed strands of the French tradition, and one is Catholic, bourgeois, conservative. The other one is free-thinking, Republican, at times bohemian, and so their flirtation has certain political and kind of historic aspect. It's it shows how maybe in this moment of disorientation, figures who come from two very different streams of the French tradition might be attracted to each other. Maud she's quite attracted to the Catholic ideas and the scruples and hang-ups of our character. Even as she prods him, she finds him fascinating, precisely because he is hung up in certain ways. And likewise, our hero is quite attracted to this woman who is not simply without principle or scruple. She instead seems to be deliberately living out a modern existence, trying to follow her own logic, which extends from the modern furniture in her apartment to her sleeping nude always, as she makes a point of saying, and even to her openness to love, or to love with a man. There's a kind of consistent type of life being lived out by her, and it's one where sin doesn't enter into the picture, right? She would not sin in her eyes by sleeping with the hero. She would instead be really living by her own principles, not that they commanded, but they totally accept it. And she would do so, or she would at least try to do so, without any feeling of shame or regret.
There's a certain complacency in Jean-Louis, the main character. For example, they're talking about having flings or one night stands, and he says, "I won't say God, but fate has kept me from such circumstances," which he acts as though it could just never happen to him. And I think that it's, in the end, it is his choice. Well, so they almost sleep, they almost have sex, and they he stops, but then she gets up and goes across the room, and he sort of chases her, and then she rejects him at that point. So I suppose it is still circumstances, protecting him in that sense, but he doesn't acknowledge the role that God plays in these things. He thinks that it's just, well, I'm just not the sort of person who ends up doing those things. There's like a complacency, a failure to own the role of grace in it, which allows him to keep having this sort of embrace of his own mediocrity. And so it's interesting that the film highlights this idea of true and false conversion, that both of the characters sort of question the reality of the conversion that he claims to have had, because they're discussing his past life, his past love affairs, and how they can relate to his Catholic faith. And then when he's later at the, I don't know what you'd call it, a dormitory or something, where the girl Francoise that he's interested in from the beginning of the film lives, he picks up a book, True and False Conversion. And I think the subtitle is like a debate on atheism or something like that. So the film is clearly wanting us to pay attention to this idea of what true conversion really is. And it clearly, I guess, thinking about it now, one thing that true conversion doesn't do, it doesn't say, and this is the point at which I'll stop. I'll convert this much, and no more. I'll convert enough to be on this side of the line of grave sin, but I'm not going to go any further than that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that might be something that is at work in the film. Just his wanting to stay in his sort of like intellectualized conception of the moral life, his conceptualizing of the life of faith as a moral code, which we later get a bit of a sermon by a priest saying Christianity is not just a moral code.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's hard to sort of get around this, because the film
there's a lot of complex ideas.
Yeah,
in
it's
the film.
it's really
and
really rich.
I've watched it twice, and I still don't see how everything connects.
Yeah, so the film is steeped in philosophical musings and references. Some of them not as apparently connected to the plot as others. But even in the back and forth among the characters, there's a real, vivacious, like hunger for grasping the concepts that are at work in people's lives. It's really exciting, actually. If I can just kind of make an aside, is that for a film that it just involves so much talking, so much dialogue, so much just sitting around and discussing, it keeps you on the edge of your seat.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so it's hard, because I feel like you can draw out so much from what's said. I mean, you just in laying out what you were thinking about all of this, you're referencing books that he's picking up and the sermon that he's hearing from the priest and then conversations that he's having. And it's like, it's a really sweeping kind of expose of these concerns. And like chance, they talk a lot about chance and how that operates in life. They talk about grace. It's interesting in that dormitory with Francoise, he pushes back on her when she says, well, for me, I get suspicious when things are going too well. And he says, well, don't you believe in grace? So he acknowledges in that moment that grace is at work. He says, that's sinning against hope. And one of the things that he keeps repeating is that for me, the decisions are easy. I make up my mind ahead of time. And then, when the situations arise, the choice is clear. My conscience is clear. I mean, she critiques him on this, saying that, well, that can't be all that grace is about, to just shore up a clear conscience. But I think that there's something admirable in this character in that he has a kind of purity of heart, even if it's a purity of half-heartedness. It's like, it's a kind of single-mindedness, a kind of, on the one hand, it may be a kind of despair of grace. On the other hand, it may be a kind of acceptance of, where he's at in life. I recalled as I was watching this, that there was a time in my life when I was just a smoker. I was just going to be a cigarette smoker. I wasn't going to spend time, hemming and hawing and wondering should I be smoking or should I not be smoking? I was like, okay, right now I'm a cigarette smoker and that's it. Yeah. And I think I was better off for it. And I think that now I'm more able to say, okay, now I'm not. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that I think that, especially for anybody who hasn't seen the film, I don't want to give the wrong impression that this character we're talking about is kind of like, that he doesn't have anything noble going on. Actually, I think he's quite sympathetic, and we find ourselves in his corner more often than not. One of the things that long sequence of the Mass at the beginning of the film does is situates everything that happens afterwards within the drama of a normal Christian lived experience, right? That this is incarnational. This is in the trenches of life. This is a Catholic who in the morning is going to Mass and then in the evening is, being seduced. And that it returns to the church throughout. Yeah. And then also one of the things that's said by the priest is that Christmas is the guarantee of our hope. And I think that this film is a lot about hope. That in his own way, though it may seem that Jean-Louis is despairing of the grace to be a saint, in his own way, he is hopeful and trusting that he's going to be carried forward. And I think even more so than he can imagine. And the image that sticks with me the most in this film, it's just beautiful, is when he's in Maud's apartment and he's talking about how he can't see himself as being a saint, but I forget what he says. He says something like,
pray for the grace to see the possibility of being a saint.
Yes. Yeah. And in that very moment, he's in the center of the frame. He's standing in front of a lamp and the light is just beautiful. It's like rays are emanating from behind him. And it's almost like in that moment, we see the possibility for him to be a saint. It's almost like an image of iconography.
Ça n'était peut-être qu'un piège du démon.
Eh bien, j'y serais tombé. Ah oui, d'une certaine façon, j'y suis tombé. Si je n'y étais pas tombé, j'aurais été un saint.
Et vous ne voulez pas être un saint?
Non, pas du tout.
Oh, qu'est-ce qu'il ne faut pas entendre. Je croyais que tout chrétien devait aspirer à la sainteté.
Quand je dis je ne veux pas, je veux dire je ne peux pas.
Quel défaitisme. Et la grâce.
Je demande à la grâce de me faire entrevoir la possibilité de l'être.
So yeah, I think that there is this hope, and it's a hope that's demonstrated in the film, that even these fallen moments are redeemed, that Christ enters into the complexity and the messiness of this man's life and of the lives of everybody there, and works. That love is there, and that love transforms.